What if beauty was never about the face at all, but about who controlled the frame? These 11 British stars were called grotesque, plain, even unwatchable, until the industry turned them into icons. No surgeries, no miracles, just wigs, lighting, camera tricks, and a little ruthless ambition. Behind every ugly duckling was a system reshaping perception in real time. This isn't a makeover story. It's a revelation. Welcome to the quiet power of illusion and the stars who were never supposed to shine. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, especially if you love stories that twist the spotlight and mess with the rules. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight? Lunch break? Can't sleep? We're all in this strange little time warp together. 1. Charles Laughton. Charles Laughton was the kind of man who looked like he had been carved out of regret. Jowly, heavy-set, and forever photographed under a sweep of theatrical lighting that didn't so much flatter as dramatize, his was not a face designed to soothe. In the 1930s, when cinema was still figuring out what beauty should look like on screen, Laughton was busy rewriting the rule book entirely. While matinee idols smoldered with symmetry, he loomed, bulbous and brooding, a face shaped more like a threat than a promise. And yet, he became a star. Laughton's rise didn't ignore his looks. It exploited them. Critics of his time described him as grotesque with an almost admiring precision, using words like unhandsome or repellent with the same ease they used riveting. The irony is this: his perceived ugliness became a kind of currency, a tool by which directors could construct fear, majesty, or psychological decay. In The Hunchback of Notre Dame, his makeup didn't mask him. It amplified something that was already there, a kind of architectural sorrow. You didn't just feel for him, you worried what that empathy said about you. But Laughton wasn't just playing monsters. He played kings, judges, gods of authority. His face, so unconventional, so uncompromising, was turned into a canvas for myth-making. The studios leaned into the illusion, wide capes that swallowed his bulk in regality, stage lighting that built cathedrals of shadow across his features, and roles that gave his deformity a kind of moral rightness. His ugliness wasn't a flaw, it was foreshadowing. What helped, too, was the era's strange double standard. A British male star, particularly one of serious craft, didn't need to be beautiful. He needed to be distinctive. And Laughton was. He was the face of villainy, of tortured genius, of the misunderstood brute. Hollywood had no shortage of pretty men. What it lacked were men who looked like they could command a guillotine with feeling. Laughton provided that. Still, the transformation wasn't all smoke and mirrors. Cinematographers knew how to make him look larger than life, because he already was. They just leaned into it. They widened the frame, softened the eyes, gave him costumes that draped like Roman sculpture. In witness for the prosecution, he's not the grotesque. He's the law. By then, the idea that Charles Laughton was too ugly to be a star had aged badly, because he'd become something else entirely, too iconic to care. What's quietly disturbing is that his transformation never made him beautiful by conventional standards. It made him symbolic, which, in cinematic terms, is even more powerful. He was remade not into a heartthrob, but into an institution, one where beauty, strangely, became irrelevant. But if Laughton's face was a cathedral of drama, the next star's was more like a teapot that refused to shatter, chipped, sturdy, and quietly, commanding a room through sheer presence alone. Let's talk about a woman who, by all the rules of mid-century glamour, shouldn't have been a star, but became something far rarer, unforgettable. 2. Margaret Rutherford. Margaret Rutherford was never a beauty, not in the way the system defined it. She looked like the ghost of an English aunt who had never quite left the room, wearing pearls that clattered when she moved and a hat that seemed to double as a barricade. Her face, deeply lined and gloriously defiant, was the kind that made studio heads nervous. But audiences? They adored her. She didn't conquer the screen by pretending to be something she wasn't. Instead, she turned her eccentricity into dominance. She weaponized the fact that she looked like she should be folding napkins at a village fete. In a cinematic world full of glamour girls with symmetrical cheekbones and practiced pouts, Rutherford's unassuming face became a radical act. Her beauty didn't need to be visible. It just needed to be unmistakable. In her breakout roles, especially as Miss Marple, Rutherford wasn't just styled to be odd. She was styled to be in charge. There's a subtle genius in that. Her wardrobe choices became declarations. Brooches like family heirlooms, hats like fortress walls, and coats that seemed to hold both secrets and scones. Makeup didn't try to erase the creases. It highlighted them. Lighting didn't soften her. It framed her like a portrait from another era. Her directors didn't ask her to look younger. They asked her to look inevitable. The real transformation came in how her presence was reframed, from comic eccentric to wise anchor. By the 1960s, when she was already in her 70s, Rutherford was being cast not in spite of her looks, but because of them. She was the moral center in a world of polished deception. She was the unfashionable woman who saw everything, and in that, she became beautiful. Not pretty, not glam, but beautiful in the sense that she had gravity. When she entered a scene, it stopped spinning. Critics loved to point out how she defied the standards. But what they often missed was how she rewrote them. She didn't get a surgical overhaul or a studio rebrand. She got something rarer, respect. And the audience saw in her what the system often missed, a kind of warmth that couldn't be manufactured, only styled correctly. In a way, Rutherford's transformation wasn't even about appearance. It was about narrative. She became beautiful because her characters mattered. Because she mattered. And once that happened, the lines on her face weren't flaws. They were evidence. But if Rutherford's presence was like a warm, eccentric breeze drifting in from a country garden, the next face would be cold, intellectual, and faintly haunted. A man who looked like he'd been sculpted by a committee of nervous schoolmasters. Strange, stiff, and somehow iconic. If you're still here after that, clearly you're one of us. So go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. This channel dives deep, and we've only just begun. And while you're listening, where are you tuning in from? What time is it? Middle of the night? Early morning scroll? Drop it in the comments. We want to know who's wandering the timeline with us. 3. Alistair Sim. Alistair Sim looked like the human embodiment of a question mark. His features didn't sit neatly in any category. Eyes too knowing, smile too sly, posture too slouched to suggest confidence, yet too poised to imply weakness. His face had the odd elegance of a man caught halfway through a transformation, professor into phantom, bishop into burglar, or perhaps the other way around. To call him unconventional was the polite mid-century way of saying he didn't look like a star. But Sim didn't need their permission. What he had instead was the slow-burning charisma of a man who had never been told to try harder. There's something defiant in that. He wasn't handsome, but he wasn't hiding either. In a cinematic age that often sorted men into archetypes, dashing leads, weathered villains, comedic sidekicks, Sim arrived like a glitch in the algorithm. He was the lead, the oddity, the conscience, and the punchline, all without changing his tie. In Scrooge, 1951, the definitive version for many, his transformation from miser to redeemer wasn't just an acting masterclass. It was a visual softening. Early in the film, the lighting curls into his face like suspicion, shadows deepen his eye sockets, his lips tighten into contempt. But as the story turns, so does the frame. His face seems fuller, his eyes warmer, not because makeup changed, but because the camera learned how to love him. Sim's physicality also played into this strange cinematic makeover. He moved like a man who had just remembered something terrible, and then decided to make a joke about it. His hunched gait, his uncertain gestures, his hesitant pauses, they weren't weaknesses. They were punctuation. You could never quite predict what he would do next, And that unpredictability made him magnetic. Not sexy, not smooth, but riveting in a way beauty rarely achieves. The industry knew what to do with him. Once they gave up trying to make him a matinee idol, they wrapped him in coats too large, collars too stiff, hats that seemed chosen for a funeral happening off-screen. And it worked. They used costume and lighting not to flatter but to frame, to build an architecture around his oddity until it became the set's center of gravity. Sim's makeover, such as it was, didn't transform him into someone more palatable. It clarified him. It made his strange allure visible. In An Inspector Calls, he's both judge and specter. He doesn't charm you. He corners you with logic and a look that says he's already guessed your worst secret. Perhaps that's the trick. Alistair Sim wasn't made beautiful in the traditional sense. He was made inevitable. The camera didn't fall in love with him. It learned to trust him. And for a man once described as shambling, that's a kind of aesthetic triumph more powerful than a chiseled jaw ever offered. And yet, if Sim was a study in subtle unease, the next name on our list made no attempt at subtlety. He arrived like a caricature, and stayed by turning that caricature into something unforgettable. A man whose face was once whispered about in hallways, ridiculed in tabloids, and eventually reframed as legendary. 4. Marty Feldman. Marty Feldman didn't just have an unusual face. He had the unusual face. The kind of face that made people pause, squint, and then politely pretend they hadn't been staring. To be blunt, because history was, his eyes didn't align. They bulged, they wandered, they practically had their own agents. And yet, Feldman didn't just become famous. He became iconic. The British press at the time didn't mince words. He was called weird-looking, bizarre, and worse, though often with a begrudging affection, the kind usually reserved for beloved neighborhood eccentrics or heavily shelled tortoises. But where many might have tried to fix the thing that made them different, Feldman doubled down. He took the feature that others called freakish and turned it into a signature. It was comedy judo. His bulging eyes, a result of a medical condition likely tied to Graves's disease, became visual shorthand for punchlines. Directors blocked shots around them. Sketch writers built entire gags on a single glance. His expression alone could steal a scene, and often did. In Young Frankenstein, the film doesn't just acknowledge his face, it celebrates it. His character Igor is introduced with a knowing wink to the audience, as if to say, yes, we know, and yes, we're going to have fun with it. But the real transformation, the made beautiful moment, isn't just about a joke landing, it's about what happens after. It's about a man who walked into a brutal industry with no intention of apologizing for his face. Feldman didn't get more symmetrical. The industry got smarter. He was lit to accentuate his expressions, not erase them. He wore costumes that exaggerated his outline, not disguised it. He wasn't softened. He was sharpened. His image was crafted to say, this man matters. There's an undercurrent of tragedy to his story, of course. Fame did not fix self-doubt. Stardom did not erase the cruelty of a world obsessed with photogenic appeal. But what it did do, what Feldman achieved, consciously or not, was to prove that beauty in film could come from boldness. That visual difference wasn't just tolerable, but desirable, when you knew how to frame it. He wasn't conventionally handsome, and that's precisely why he became a legend. Because Marty Feldman taught us something the next star knew all too well. Sometimes, it's not about becoming beautiful. It's about making people uncomfortable with what they think beauty should look like. 5. Kenneth Williams. Kenneth Williams lived like a man on the edge of a grimace. His voice curled with theatrical disdain, his posture arched like punctuation, and his face, angular, tight-lipped, twitching between suspicion and superiority, seemed built for satire. He didn't smile so much as bare his teeth. And yet, he became a star. Not in spite of those features, but because of what they allowed him to weaponize: control. By mid-century standards, Williams was not leading man material. The era prized square jaws, relaxed shoulders, and the kind of masculine ease that looked good on posters. Williams had none of that. He had cheekbones that sliced, eyes that darted, and a mouth that always seemed to be preparing for a cutting remark. He was once described, even by himself, as too ugly for television. And that wasn't humility. It was a mantra, one he seemed both to resent and to perform. The self-awareness became part of the act. Williams's on-screen persona, camp, biting, often hysterical in both senses, wasn't a mask hiding insecurity. It was a framework. He played men who were too sharp to be charming, too clever to be liked, and too fast to be ignored. In the Carry-On films, he wasn't the one who got the girl. He was the one who questioned why anyone would bother. And yet, his transformation into something close to cinematic beauty happened slowly, almost imperceptibly. The studios didn't try to make him handsome. They made him precise. His hair was always slicked into position. His wardrobe, neat suits, crisp uniforms, period costumes, was chosen to enhance his angularity rather than conceal it. Lighting was used to soften his profile just enough to suggest intention, not accident. The camera learned to treat his face not as a problem, but as an instrument. The beauty wasn't in the features, it was in the timing, in the rhythm. Williams' control over voice, expression, and movement was almost surgical. He didn't radiate warmth, he radiated discipline. And in an ensemble full of broad caricatures and exaggerated sexuality, he became something cooler, more stylized, more memorable. Off-camera, things were more complicated. Williams was reportedly consumed by self-loathing, unable to reconcile the crowd's laughter with his own isolation. But on screen, he became untouchable. His image was made, not by transforming him into someone else, but by refining what was already there. What looked like an eccentric face became a sculpted tool for ridicule, authority, and precision. In the end, Williams wasn't made beautiful by softening the edges. He was made beautiful by making those edges indispensable. His face didn't need to be loved, it needed to be used, and it was, brilliantly. But if Williams was elegance delivered at knife point, the next star wore authority like a uniform, and was treated at first like a punchline in one. Her body was mocked, her power played for laughs, and yet she became a symbol of strength so enduring that her silhouette alone could set the tone of a scene. Let's talk about Hattie Jacques. 6. Hattie Jacques. Hattie Jacques didn't ask for subtlety. She was cast as the battle axe, the matron, the heavy-handed nurse. And she played each one with a kind of regal contempt that made everyone else in the scene look slightly underdressed. Her figure, famously wide and often used for comedic shorthand, became both her burden and her brand. And yet, over time, that same body, derided in tabloids and boxed into stereotypes, was transformed into an image of authority, even grace. In post-war British comedy, size was rarely neutral. It was a prop. For Jacques, whose body was bigger than the standard pin-up fare of the time, the scripts often wrote the joke before she walked into the room. Her presence was used to imply intimidation, prudishness, or absurd competence. She was the no-nonsense foil to the lecherous fool, the unimpressed superior, the cold hospital matron. It was rarely flattering, but it was commanding. Her physical transformation was, at one point, quite literal. In the 1960s, before filming The Bobo, she reportedly lost over 5 stone, about 70 pounds, through a strict regimen. The public noticed. The change was covered. But the industry didn't quite know what to do with a slimmer Hattie. The roles didn't change. She was still the matron. The system didn't reward the effort with a romantic subplot. What it showed instead was how tightly beauty, in her case, was tied to function. It wasn't about her being desired. It was about how her body could be used to control the comic frame. Still, there were moments, brief, remarkable ones, when Hattie Jacques was lit not as a joke, but as a character worth watching. In Sykes, her face is sometimes given the same lighting grace that would be reserved for a dramatic lead. Her expressions, subtle, weary, laced with wit, begin to take on warmth. And warmth, in that context, is beauty. Costuming also played a crucial role. Her uniforms were tailored with intention, framing her not as frumpy, but as unyielding. Her wigs were chosen to signal rank. Her walk was paced with the confidence of someone who never had to chase approval. Over time, her on-screen body stopped being just a punchline. It became a kind of architecture. Off-screen, the story was harder. Personal grief, relationship difficulties, and health issues marked her later years. But on screen, especially in her prime, she had an undeniable poise. She knew her role, and she performed it with the kind of finesse that forced the audience to look past the typecasting. Eventually, people did. Hattie Jacques was made beautiful not by becoming smaller, but by being filmed as someone bigger than her role, bigger than the jokes, bigger than the frame itself. And just when you think the industry couldn't possibly be more obsessed with packaging women by type, in walks a figure who did everything they told her not to, and still became a bombshell. 7. Barbara Windsor. Barbara Windsor was 5 feet tall and built like a punchline. In the 1960s, when the British film industry was producing glamour with assembly line precision, she was cast as the walking exclamation mark, bubbly, brassy, and bust first. Her voice bounced an octave higher than everyone else's, and her laugh could curdle milk. She wasn't just typecast, she was hypercast, designed to make everyone in the room feel overdressed and undersexed. But the real irony? Barbara Windsor was never supposed to be beautiful. Not in the classical sense. In fact, the press often treated her as too short, too loud, too artificial. And yet, she became one of the most recognizable sex symbols of her era. How? Not by hiding those features, but by having the nerve to decorate them. In the Carry On films, Windsor's beauty was treated like a spectacle. Her body was photographed as if it were a special effect. There was a kind of surrealism to it, costumes so tight they squeaked, wigs that reached the ceiling, and camera angles that seemed permanently tilted in her favor. These weren't accidents, they were strategy. Windsor's look was engineered, like a dollhouse built in a thunderstorm. And if it was exaggerated, well, so was everything else on the screen. The transformation wasn't just visual, it was economic. She invested in herself. By the 1980s, with her screen career wobbling and her public image battered by the kind of press scrutiny reserved exclusively for women over 40, Windsor reportedly spent tens of thousands on cosmetic procedures. The tabloids ran the numbers gleefully. Facelifts, skin treatments, the usual surgeries whispered about as if they were confessions. And yet, what those same outlets never admitted was this. Barbara Windsor didn't chase youth, she chased power. The makeover, if you want to call it that, peaked in her EastEnders years. Suddenly, the hair was bigger, the makeup sharper, and the voice, still unmistakable, had gained something new: command. As Peggy Mitchell, she wasn't a bombshell. She was a matriarch. She ran a pub, a family, and more subtly, a national nostalgia for an idea of womanhood that had both glamour and grit. She didn't seduce. She ordered. Her beauty wasn't real in the way critics demand, but it was real in the way audiences believe. Because by the time the industry had finished turning her into a joke, Barbara Windsor had become something more permanent, a symbol. She had reshaped what British sex appeal could look like: shrill, fierce, exaggerated, aging, and still entirely her own. And here's the kicker. Barbara Windsor wasn't made beautiful in a conventional sense. She was remade again and again, by studios, by soaps, by surgery, by sheer bloody will. Her glamour was manufactured, but her survival was not. But if Windsor's makeover was bold and commercial, the next star's transformation was almost mythological. A woman born with a name the tabloids mocked, cast as a sex symbol against a tide of disbelief and packaged not by nature but by design. 8. Diana, Dors. Diana Dors was a blonde bombshell in a country that didn't know what to do with one. Born Diana Fluck, a surname British gossip columns could barely resist, she entered the film industry as a teenager and was rebranded before she could sign her own contracts. Her career was a case study in artificial beauty, a woman molded, styled, and sold as a fantasy for audiences who didn't quite believe their own desire. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Dors wasn't discovered. She was assembled. She came through the rank organization's so-called charm school, a studio system not unlike Hollywood's, where young women were trained in elocution, posture, hair, makeup, and camera seduction. Her transformation was institutional. Her body was made photogenic, her voice was made posh, and her name was made printable. And still, the transformation didn't work the way it was supposed to. British critics, never fully comfortable with American-style sex appeal, often treated Dors with suspicion. She was too obvious, too knowing, too Hollywood. They called her the English Marilyn Monroe, but they said it with a wince. Her body was praised and parodied in the same breath, her sensuality treated like a malfunction in the national brand. But the camera? The camera adored her. Dors understood the lens better than her directors did. She moved with the slow precision of someone who'd rehearsed every angle. Her makeup was theatrical, her hair blindingly blonde, her wardrobe sculpted like armor. She made herself luminous. Not naturally, not effortlessly, but intentionally. In her earlier films, the transformation is nearly total. Watch Yield to the Night or A Kid for Two Farthings, and you see a woman playing a version of femininity that is part dream, part dare. Her beauty becomes a challenge. Are you watching because you want to? Or because she made sure you couldn't look away? Off-screen, the story was less glamorous. Dors struggled with press mockery, financial ruin, and the creeping sense that the industry had only ever rented her face. But even as the roles thinned and the budgets shrank, she refused to fade. She reinvented herself on talk shows, in cabarets, and later as a TV presence. Still blonde, still stylized, still performing the performance. What makes Dors fascinating isn't that she was made beautiful. It's that she exposed the manufacturing process in real time. She let herself be assembled, but she never pretended it was natural. Her beauty was not an accident. It was an achievement. And while Dors was polishing the illusion, the next actress on our list was quietly doing the opposite, shifting between plain and striking depending on how the scene needed her. She wasn't a bombshell. She was a chameleon. And she proved, time and again, that beauty could be nothing more and nothing less than a matter of lighting. 9. Joan Sims. Joan Sims was the kind of actress who could be beautiful on a Wednesday and unrecognizable by Thursday, depending entirely on what the script had in mind. Her face was a canvas the British film industry used, sometimes with affection, sometimes with brutal indifference, to paint whatever stereotype it needed. Spinster, scold, nurse, drunk aunt, occasionally radiant woman, but rarely for long. In the Carry On films, where she starred more than 24 times, Sims was often cast opposite younger, more flamboyant performers. Her characters were frequently the foil, the nagging wife, the plain secretary, the flustered middle-class nightmare. She played them to perfection, but that perfection came at a cost. The styling did not flatter. The wardrobe didn't whisper glamour. And the lighting? It rarely helped. But then, every so often, something shifted. A costume would cling instead of drape. Her hair would be swept up rather than flattened. The lighting would find her cheekbones. And suddenly, Joan Sims was beautiful, not by accident but by omission of sabotage. In Carry On Cowboy, for example, she appears for a fleeting moment in glamorous makeup and a more romantic silhouette, and you see it, the star she could have been in a different system. A different era. A different set of priorities. Her transformation, such as it was, came in glimpses. The industry never rebranded her. She rebranded herself, in pauses, in subtext, in sheer skill. There was a moment in her later television work, especially in As Time Goes By, where her warmth outpaced her character. The laugh lines that had once been exaggerated for ridicule became signs of emotional gravity. She wasn't just the funny one. She was the one who understood the timing, the rhythm, the heartbeat underneath the comedy. Joan Sims' real challenge was consistency. The roles she was offered boxed her into a kind of performative plainness. She was made to be forgettable, comically inconvenient, a woman whose beauty had allegedly expired before the first scene even began. But when directors allowed it, or simply looked the other way, she shone. Fan commentary today often reflects this. Viewers remember the exact scenes where she suddenly looked gorgeous. It wasn't transformation by surgery or reinvention. It was always there, just rarely invited to stay. Off-screen, her story was tinged with loneliness and ill health, particularly in later years. But on-screen, she held the strange power of someone who could outact her own typecasting. That's not easy. That's not normal. That's a quiet kind of triumph. Joan Sims wasn't made beautiful by the industry. She was allowed occasionally to appear beautiful when the camera happened to be feeling generous. And those glimpses became legend, because the audience, it turns out, noticed. They always notice. But while Sims's beauty flickered between scenes like a hidden message, the next star on our list embraced her contradictions with full-volume defiance. She wasn't made beautiful so much as recoded. Brassy, loud, a little dangerous, and utterly unforgettable. And she made sure that when she walked on screen, the lighting didn't just find her, it obeyed. 10. Hermione Baddeley. Hermione Baddeley made an art form out of being unfiltered. Her voice could crack like a whip across drawing rooms. Her laughter, too loud, too long, felt engineered to interrupt. And that, of course, was her power. She wasn't elegant, at least not in the ways post-war cinema demanded. She was brassy, blousy, a bit much, the kind of descriptors that British critics of the time deployed when a woman refused to stay in the margins. But there was always more going on than the noise. Baddeley came from theater, trained, disciplined, sharp. Her comic timing was so precise it bordered on weaponized, and when she entered film, it was with that same stage confidence, minus the decorum. She didn't glide on screen, she stomped. And her characters followed suit. Maids with too much eyeliner, mothers who'd seen too much, widows with secrets, barmaids with opinions. She wasn't cast to be subtle. She was cast to puncture things. And yet, within the cacophony, there was a method. The costumes were deliberate. The voice was calibrated. In prestige films like Room at the Top, Baddeley's role wasn't just comic relief. It was a study in social codes. She played vulgarity like a violin, turned every unpretty gesture into class commentary. In that sense, she wasn't performing against the system. She was diagnosing it. Beauty, in Baddeley's case, didn't come from softening. It came from doubling down. Her hair was often styled too big, her makeup too bold, her clothing one pattern short of a punchline. And yet, when placed in the right light, her face told different stories. In Mary Poppins, she's just another eccentric. But watch closely. There's a gravity behind the eye rolls. A kind of wisdom you don't expect from someone dressed like a wallpaper sample. That tension made her unforgettable. What changed her image wasn't a makeover. It was context. American television, especially in her later years, gave Baddeley more room to explore layers. She played relatives, spinsters, comedic agitators, and while the aesthetic didn't change, the tone did. Suddenly, her roles had more warmth, less mockery. She wasn't just the loud woman anymore. She was the one with stories. Critics eventually came around, sort of. They called her vivid, memorable, scene-stealing, which is how you compliment someone while still implying they're not quite beautiful. But fans knew better. They saw the intelligence beneath the glitter, the precision beneath the chaos. And for a certain generation, Baddeley was the first time they saw a woman on screen who didn't lower her voice to fit the room. She didn't become beautiful because she changed. She became beautiful because the lens, at last, adjusted to her frequency. And finally, there's the man who spent most of his career being the embodiment of effortless masculinity, but whose appearance was quietly and strategically altered from day one. Because even James Bond wore a disguise. 11. Sean Connery. Sean Connery was the kind of man the 1960s decided was the ideal. Tall, brooding, Scottish in a way that felt dangerous and mythic. His jawline could have been used in architecture. His voice was a low growl wrapped in velvet. He was Bond, James Bond, and therefore, by cultural decree, he was beautiful. But here's the part the posters never told you. Sean Connery wasn't naturally effortless. Not entirely. In fact, from the very beginning, his image was constructed piece by meticulous piece. And one of those pieces was his hair, or rather, the conspicuous management of its absence. Connery began losing his hair in his 20s, well before most of the world even knew his name. By the time he landed the role of Bond in Dr. No, 1962, the famous thick, dark hair seen on screen was not a gift from genetics. It was the work of a well-fitted toupee and carefully plotted camera angles. The studio knew exactly what they were doing. Masculinity, in their version of the fantasy, came with a full head of hair, and Connery, to his credit, played along, reluctantly. He would later speak in interviews about disliking the toupees, feeling the dissonance between the persona on screen and the man underneath. But Connery was no fool. He understood the transaction. The hairpiece wasn't just cosmetic, it was symbolic. It sealed the fantasy. It allowed audiences to believe they were watching a man who was invulnerable to age, insecurity, or decline. Because Bond wasn't just a character. He was a cultural hallucination. And Connery, despite or perhaps because of his imperfections, fit the role too well. The irony, of course, is that part of what made him seem so effortlessly masculine was how well the production hid the effort. Lighting softened the temples. Angles reduced the visible hairline. Editors, stylists, and makeup artists became silent co-stars. But beyond Bond, Connery's relationship with his image became more complex. As he aged, didn't hide the baldness anymore. He embraced it. Let it become part of the character. In The Untouchables, The Rock, and Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, Connery projected authority not in spite of his aging appearance, but because of it. The toupee was gone, but the charisma remained, maybe even increased. He was no longer selling invincibility. He was selling gravitas. That shift, subtle but crucial, was Connery's real transformation. Not from bald to not bald, or young to old, but from beauty as fantasy to beauty as presence. In his later years, when the tuxedos were traded for trench coats and wisdom lines carved deeper into his face, Connery radiated a different kind of appeal. Less magazine cover, more myth. And unlike many stars who clung to their golden era with cosmetic desperation, Connery allowed the mask to drop, eventually, which is what made his early artifice so fascinating. The most masculine man in cinema was, from his debut, wearing a disguise. And when that disguise was no longer needed, he became something rarer in Hollywood, someone who looked better the more he stopped trying. In the end, Connery's beauty wasn't about looks at all. It was about the idea of him. The idea that power, charm, and danger could be compressed into a single man. Hairpiece optional.